So it seems like Roger Cook can barely do a press conference these days
Chased out of town.
someone chasing him around, asking him about Woodside of the Northwest Shelf.
If it's not you, it's someone else. He's been up in Karratha and the Pilbara the past couple of days, and didn't seem like he actually met a single local who wanted to talk to him. Just one very angry local, letting him know what she thought.
Premier, I want to know exactly what you're doing about what they're doing out there in my country. And you too, Kevin. You too. You're supposed to be representing the people here. What are you doing here? What are you doing for the borough? What are you doing? What, you're going over here to go and whitewash what you're doing, Premier? When have you consulted with me? Get out of my face.
One very angry local, Raylene Cooper, Marathon Traditional Custodian. The clip is pretty good. The clip is pretty fiery.
Oh, it's just Ray on an average day, doing what she does best, letting him know what it's all about.
That's true. Kevin Michelle, the member for Pilbara, cops a bit of a spray.
You too, Kevin.
Not that anyone's going to really know who it's for, because
which would be the biggest indignity of all, I reckon, of the day is Kev missing the photo op because Ray,
big time,
her own camera woman, because the others wouldn't film her properly. Didn't quite squeeze him into frame.
You're going whitewashing Woodside and all the industry and Perdaman, and Kevin, you too. You're useless as fuck. You're useless. What are you doing?
That was one appearance that Premier Cook made in the Pilbara. He also went to Roebourne District High School.
Yeah. An hour or so later, stood up next to Woodside CEO Meg O'Neill and a couple of other people. No locals, again, that I could see. It's in the middle of the school.
There was the school principal there, and the school tuck shop lady was in the photo.
No school kids, though, of course, being in the middle of the school holiday. So, again, not much real flesh pressing going on.
No, certainly not by the look of that photo. Supposedly they did a tour of the school. I mean, it's good that the school upgrades are being built. So what's happening is that Woodside are throwing in $20 million to finish the school upgrades, which began, I think, construction began late 23 or early 24. But there is a bit of a backstory there in that the state government promised the community the new school. They said that they were going to do the upgrades. They did a co-design process with the community, with the elders, where the community said, this is what we want. The department said to them, we will deliver this. I did a little bit of reporting on this when I was up there at Nada Media. Basically then there were delays, COVID, etc. The education department turned around and said, we can't afford it anymore. We can't afford to deliver these full upgrades. We're going to deliver these partial upgrades. And so the old classrooms, which were fairly dingy, fairly small, were going to continue to be the secondary classroom. My understanding is that this new funding from Woodside allows the full upgrades to be done, which I think is a great thing.
It is. That's terrific, but it's fucking insane that that's what it takes.
Well, exactly.
It's a school in one of the lowest socioeconomic areas of the state, which contributes more to the state's coffers than any other part of the country.
Exactly.
Like famously the engine room of the national economy, the Pilbara, and Roebourne is, a place that is a very historical town, home to, large numbers of traditional custodians of the country. They're ripping the iron ore and processing the gas and, making the fertiliser on. And they can't even build them a new set of school classrooms until one of those fucking companies turns up with the checkbook for a big photo op.
Exactly. Yeah, it leaves a pretty bad taste in one's mouth. I mean, especially given that...
Well, it's insane that they can't just have a fairly rationalised taxation system.
Just tax them. Literally just tax them and pay for it with taxes. That's the core function of government.
Tens of billions of dollars out of the very country this school is built on, out of the very people whose kids are going to this school.
Yeah.
And they can't somehow find a way to recoup a tiny fraction of that without giving these companies a chance to stand up as though it's coming just from the goodness of the CEO's heart. I mean, It just seems like a very backwards way of doing business.
Yeah, and I mean, especially given, the history of Woodside and the damage to the Murujuga rock art and, the way that company is operated in those communities, I think this is the kind of thing that history will judge us poorly for, will judge the state of Western Australia poorly for. I mean, using kids as billboards for fossil fuels is one thing, but then doing it in that particular community, I think there's
using their classrooms as the billboards is quite another. It so happened that aside from Raylene, the only other person who tried to draw any attention to this during the week was Brad Pettitt, the Greens MLC, running for re-election along with a bunch of others. And I got a chance to sit down with Brad just a few moments ago, chat about some of these issues, really, about the sort of the broader issue of WA as a captured state where this sort of thing is just par for the course, business as usual. Brad, welcome to the last place on earth.
Great to be here. This is a good spot to be for the last place on earth.
It is. It's a great place to wait out the apocalypse. Speaking of apocalyptic, for the past 4 years, you've been the only Greens MP in WA State Parliament. How's that been for you? Made any nice friends?
Actually, people are very polite, but no, I made no friends. I'm looking forward to having friends after March 8th. Look, on one level, it's been extremely frustrating because you've had Labor with a huge majority in both houses of the WA Parliament really uninterested in having a conversation around making their own legislation better or coming up with any ideas that aren't their own.
Yeah.
And that's just been that was really frustrating for the first year. I think I learned pretty soon after that you can still get change, but it was not through constructive conversation.
Right.
It was actually Labor have proved themselves to be pretty, glass-jawed, and if you land some good criticisms, things change pretty quickly in the background. And, so there's so realising that you can put pressure on in different ways, but also, I guess fundamentally my role over the last 4 years has been just shining a light on what's happening because I'm the only person really to the left of Labor in a very conservative parliament.
And was that a bit of a wake-up call to you, just how little they were willing to engage constructively? Did you go in kind of with some slightly sort of like naive optimism?
Yeah, look, because I've been mayor of a city for more than a decade, and I've worked with all these people and constructively engaged with them for more than a decade and kind of shared ideas, and I just assumed it would be a continuation of that. And just realising how the parliament and WA politics just shuts that down. At a local level you can do it, at a state level you can't.
Why is that? What happens once you get inside Parliament? Why do they change their tune so much?
Everything is so controlled, and at the moment I think it's probably worse than it's ever been. It's like everything goes through the Premier's office, I guess through Cabinet to some degree, and you have a very controlled, media-managed process in which a very small number of people actually are putting forward the ideas and making the decisions that affect the state.
And is that just Labor? Is that WA Labor? Is that the legacy of Mark McGowan? Is it this government particularly? Is it the fact that they've got both houses in such overwhelming numbers?
I think it's a combination of all those things. I've been told that the concentration of power in the Premier's office certainly really ramped up with McGowan, especially because he's set himself up as such a powerful figure. Yeah. I mean, after the 2017 election, which was a huge win, and then an even bigger win in the 2021 COVID election, everything ultimately went through there, and it was, and look, even Cook has taken over, but all of McGowan's staff are in Cook's office.
Yeah. So has there been much change, or has it been a fairly kind of like smooth transition to the next guy?
I'm told that pretty much everybody who is in McGowan's office is now in Cook's office. Yeah. So so the Premier's office remains the same, different spokesperson. Look, and I think you can see that because ultimately you see Cook trying to be McGowan, and I mean I've known Roger for a long time, and often I look, right, Roger, you don't really believe that. Yeah. but saying things that. Do
you think he pulls it off? Can he run the same lines McGowan used to run and make it stick like?
Yeah, I think McGowan believed it. I mean, that was the great strength of McGowan, who was his own man. Yeah. And I think, what I really hope is that after the election, Roger Cook can also find his own voice because there's actually a decent human there. Yeah.
But is there a strong person there? Is there someone who can actually sort of like stand up and lead both his party and the state? Yeah. Look,
it's a question I don't know. Look, you would hope so. Yeah. And I think we need that, but we need that strong person to be one with empathy. Yeah. And one that kind of looks at the evidence, not this just kind of like my way or the highway, and also just this. In fact, we need someone who can stand up to the vested interests of this state, and it's a different kind of strong person that we've had because what we saw under McGowan, I think, was a very cosy relationship with the resource industry and especially the gas industry in this state. And someone needs to stand up against this because it's putting WA's future at risk in multiple ways. So obviously from a climate perspective, but also economically, where we've got so many eggs in so few baskets. That I think we should be worried about our future.
Well, I mean, it's something we speak about a lot on this podcast, and at the Last Place on Earth in general, is the cosy relationship between not just the government and industry, but also obviously the media in this state is dominated by Seven West, owned by Kerry Stokes, a mining billionaire himself. Can you kind of give us a sense of what that looks like in terms of how the laws get made and how the deals get done? Like, what's it like being in a parliament that is just kind of like so closely controlled?
Yeah, and what's frustrating is you really see it, because instead of having a rational discussion around saying, look, here's how you could reduce emissions, here's how you could do a whole bunch of things, you just think they're just not on the table.
Yeah.
No one will talk about it.
Yeah.
One of my experiences of this parliament is I started running a tally around how many times have people actually mentioned the word climate change or emissions reduction in this parliament. I can count it on one hand. How are we silent? How is a Labor, supposed to be progressive government, silent on the biggest issue that we face in a whole term of parliament? Because that's what they've been. And as a result, emissions have gone up, and we are the laggard state.
Yeah, and so you spoke a moment ago about how you initially tried to kind of engage constructively and have conversations and, persuade them to come to the table. And after a while, you decided there wasn't much mileage in that approach and you started kind of turning up the heat. Can you talk about some of the areas where you think you've been able to bring pressure to bear, where you've actually managed to kind of make them concede?
Yeah. Look, some of them are, and look, there must be small wins, and I'll give you one example. Early on, WA was one of the few states that didn't have subsidies for electric vehicles, and I was like, seriously? And I was saying to the minister at the time, Bill Johnston, he said, "I'm never going to do that."
Right.
I was like, really? I mean, like every other state's doing this. He's like, well, why would I? And then anyway, so we ran a pretty strong campaign and put a whole bunch of motions through Parliament just to embarrass government and to highlight quite strongly that WA was being left behind. And then, of course, ultimately, they do it on their own terms, in their own way, but they announced it.
Yeah.
How much of that's our pressure versus others, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I can give you an example where it was my favourite, very small one, where it was clearly our pressure, where a local retailer who sold electric bikes for people with disabilities on the NDIS couldn't sell them anymore because there was a weird law that they're too wide. And WA has this weird rule around width of bikes.
Yeah.
And the government refused to change. It's a regulation. It could be just changed by the minister overnight. Government refused to say, we're going to do a review in 2026. We'll look at it then. I'm like, literally, people on the NDIS can't buy a tricycle. We worked out that police bikes were also too wide.
Yeah.
And so my staff went out and measured up one of the police bikes out the front of it while they're getting coffee.
Yeah.
So we phrased a question to ask in Parliament around would government be banning police bikes?
It might be safer as I did. I've seen enough videos of the cops coming off, going down the stairs at Elizabeth Quay to think maybe they do need a new fleet to get them around.
Anyway, between the time we put that question in at 10 a.m. And when it had to be answered at 4:30, at 1 o'clock they changed the regulations.
Right. So it's easy enough.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can just find the right lever.
It's about finding levers, finding the right pressure, whether that's embarrassing them in the newspapers or online or asking the right questions in Parliament, you can do it.
Yeah. And how does that feel when you get a win like that?
Oh, look, it's satisfying. But I'd rather be collaborative. I mean,
how's it feel more generally to know that that's just not on the table? That as much good faith as you might bring, you're just not going to be met with a response from this.
Look,
government.
it is. And it's really frustrating. But that said, people often ask me, do you wish you hadn't had, if you hadn't known it'd be like this, do you wish you hadn't done it? And I always say no to that because I often think, wow, if I wasn't there or someone like a Green wasn't there, who would be asking these questions? Who would be shining a light on this stuff?
Yeah.
And look, I only got in by a couple hundred votes. It was really close. And I often wondered what this Parliament might have looked like if there was no one asking anything that actually was shining a light on the gas industry, on renewables, on the transition, on environment, all the social issues that we've been looking at.
Speaking of shining a light, a little bird or a few little birds recently have been telling me about an experience they've heard you had a few months back inside Parliament on a day where the WA government bragged to the world that they'd just sort of put enough pressure on the federal government that they were going to completely roll back and destroy the nature protection laws that they had an election mandate for in 2022, the nature positive legislation. And I heard there was a bit of movement on the back stairs at Parliament that kind of gave a bit of a window into how this all operates, how it works.
I was in Parliament, and Parliament wasn't actually. It was pretty early in the morning, so there weren't many MPs around at this time. I was just chatting to a colleague, and if anyone who's been in Parliament House, there's these weird internal stairs, which are just really for MPs and ministers to quickly run into the chamber and vote. They're not public. They're not the grand public stairs. They're very narrow, certainly not compliant. And up this very narrow internal stairway comes, led by Minister David Michael, from who has minerals and petroleum, leading a bunch of people from the Chamber of Minerals and Energy and other key peak lobby groups up the back stairs, not up the public stairs, around the corner into the Premier's office. Now, later on, I was outside the Premier's office at another event, and then this is probably about 45 minutes later, they all come out again of the Premier's office, down the stairs, out into what's called the Fern Garden, where often they do media, and then then the Minister and the Premier together stood and basically repeated the lines that I'm sure they had worked up together. And I just thought, wow, that if you could distill state capture in Western Australia, that's it. That literally you've got industry who has a back door, literally, into the Premier's office before they go and speak to the world. It feels so broken. I mean, and this is when the conservation sector can't even get a meeting. Hasn't even had a meeting. It's.
And when was this? What day?
This would have been late November.
Right. So right at the time.
Right at the time. Right in that week when the Premier bragged that he had basically told Albo to pull the nature positive laws.
Hunting impacts with the mining sector, I think he called it afterwards, proudly at an industry dinner.
Yeah. No, and that was, you could just see that all together, and I was like, wow, that idea though that WA's interests are the same as the mining and gas industry's interests, I think is a really terrible assumption and a broken assumption. And it's actually government not doing its job, which is actually to stand back, and actually the government's job is to weigh up everybody's interests. And I feel like that relationship now is so close and so captured, and you see it through the revolving door where McGowan's out into these sectors. People who are in those key companies are in the Premier's office. You almost couldn't make it more broken than it currently is.
What does that mean for the rest of us? Like, what are the implications, do you think, of that for WA and for the rest of the country and even for the world, given what we're talking about?
It's really challenging because, one, it's now becomes very hard to shift WA because WA is so enmeshed now. It's almost it's beyond donations. I mean, we talk about it goes beyond merely we get money and donations from these groups. It's much deeper. It's a deeper form of capture now around jobs, around relationships, around a whole mindset. So undoing this is going to be really challenging and really hard. And when you've got a media that's also repeating those same lines, it becomes really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, how important do you think the role of the media in all of this is?
Oh, it matters. But I think it matters less in terms of influencing public than we think.
Yeah.
But it matters more in the minds of the politicians.
Yeah.
So they're obsessed. They're obsessed by that. If I do something that Kerry Stokes and Seven West Media don't like, it'll be catastrophic. So they're almost second guessing themselves around how will this play out in the West Australian.
Why do they care? Why do they mind so much? Like you say, it's not as though anyone I know walking out of the studio here is going to be sitting at one of the many cafes dotted around South Freo, leafing through many copies of the West Australian. People are much more likely to be getting their news online, from Instagram, from the New York Times maybe, from apps, from wherever. But it still seems the front page of the paper really has this kind of powerful grasp on politicians in WA.
It does. And there is I think it's out of proportion now, given ultimately really the declining influence of that. But it's still... And look, and I think they got burnt. And I think there's a whole bunch of the trauma that they got from the time when they tried the super resource profits tax and and the pushback that everyone that industry used the media to basically overturn for Rudd especially.
Yeah.
I think there's a real gun shyness now to ever cross them. And I think they're almost holding it over them. If you dare do anything, we'll amass our immense resources.
I mean, I do remember that when Roger Cook came in, one of the first things that happened was the West suddenly dialed up a campaign against the Aboriginal cultural heritage laws that had just been brought in, to the point that after a few weeks of kind of fairly front page coverage, one of the first things Cook did as Premier was wind back those laws and repeal the legislation. So I guess, do you think there's kind of like almost a sense of once bitten, twice shy? Or
Oh, look, there is a bit of that, but it's also lack of courage. This is actually what, and this is how it comes to the heart of my frustration about this Labor government, and probably both federal and state, but especially state. It's just, where is the courage to stand up and actually just do what's right? And sometimes you actually got to say, no, I appreciate that's your interest, but that's different to the state's interest, and we're going to push back on that. You just never see it.
So, I mean, that just leaves you, right? As sort of, you're not going to get it from the Libs, you're not going to get it from Labor. For the last 4 years, you've been the lone voice in Parliament. Have you had anyone with you during that time?
I've got lots of great people with me. So no, I haven't been lonely at all. And this is, I mean, we've got an amazing community of people who are getting increasingly frustrated, increasingly exasperated, and even better organised. And that's the Greens, but also much bigger than the Greens is a whole sector out there. And this is in a range of areas. We've talked a lot about environment and resources, but I mean, the same thing applies to youth justice. It applies to homelessness and housing. We've seen on so many ways a frustration with a timid government who actually won't make the hard decisions to actually fix the problems in front of us. And so I felt like actually deeply empowered, because each of those groups come to me, ask me to ask questions, ask me to make statements and kind of shine a light on things that couldn't have happened.
And
otherwise.
is that making a difference? Is it having an impact? Is there a way for people to actually kind of try and get in and change what's going on?
I think...
Because at times it can feel like it's completely hopeless.
No, look,
it can feel like a brick wall.
Yeah, and that's why I hesitate in answering the question, because I think it's hard to say what difference did it make the last 4 years.
Yeah.
But I think it kept it on the agenda. It shined, and I think now then, here we are, 50 days today exactly from the election, where at least all of those things now are visible, are spoken about, are understood, and now people can choose to actually how do they change the state and what kind of parliament we have next. And I remain much more excited knowing that Labor were highly unlikely to control the upper house after this election, and the new upper house comes in May, and that's a game changer, because especially if the Greens and other progressives can get the balance of power on the crossbench, then we can really challenge Labor to actually be their better selves, because I really think they've been their worst selves the last few years.
So you're optimistic that you can get the balance power? You're expecting or hoping for a hung parliament and think it's...
Yeah, so then, look, based on the numbers of the last poll, we'll get 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Labor have been quite upfront with me, saying that they expect they'll get minimum of 14, as high as 16.
Yeah.
So obviously you need 19 is how many you need to get a vote
And
through.
they're not concerned that the Libs might sweep in and get 20 or 22 seats to get majority themselves.
It seems highly unlikely. Yeah. I mean, and again, I won't out people who are telling me this, but senior Liberals have said to me, in the lower house, if they get double figures, they'll be happy.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so presumably they're not expecting to double that in the upper house.
No, that's right.
So what does that composition look like then? It's kind of it's Labor with minority in the upper house, or probably the most seats, but fewer than half, and then the Libs with a handful.
The Libs will have 10, 10 or probably. So then there's every bit of legislation. Then there's a choice for Labor.
Yeah.
Do they negotiate with the Libs, or do they negotiate with a progressive crossbench?
Yeah.
And I think what I really hope is that they negotiate with us and make that legislation better, more progressive, ultimately more representative of what Labor have historically stood for. Yeah. I mean, this has been the most conservative Labor government in the history of this state. Yeah. So much so that, again, senior Liberals have said to me that this is basically a Liberal government. I mean, in fact, there was a bit of a joke going around for a while that McGowan was the best Liberal Premier that this state has had in several decades.
And the most popular, I dare say, for reasons that continue to get past me. All right, so say you manage to, you chip away at the sort of the supremacy that they've enjoyed for the past 4 years, and it's a hung parliament with a number of Greens in there. How do you work as a bloc? How do you operate? How do you negotiate to get outcomes and extract what you want from this government?
So then it's a couple of things. It's obviously working on individual bits of legislation and amending those to make them better. But there's also the more proactive stuff, actually saying we're only going to support all of these bits of legislation if you also support legislation that we're going to bring in.
Yep.
And then us being really clear around the legislation that we want to see. Take one example, WA still doesn't have any legislation around climate, no targets.
Yep.
We don't even have it.
Where's it gone? Like there was an act. They had it on the...
Yeah, so they introduced it in 2023 to the lower house.
Yeah.
It never got debated.
Because that's what they said in 2021. It was an election promise, right? They were going to legislate a climate change act, and presumably there's not much time left, and there's no time left.
No, it's gone. So Parliament's been prorogued. So that bill is dead.
Yeah.
So we would say we need that bill, and we would ultimately make a better version of that, which would have a 2030 target. I mean, there were some good bits about that bill around, especially government emissions. It was quite ambitious, but it didn't ask anything of industry.
Yeah.
It certainly didn't ask anything until 2035. So we'll be trying to bring that forward, be much more transparent, and also actually demand that we start to bring emissions down this decade.
Yeah. Okay. So that's climate. Don't know if that's going to win you enough votes to get over the line in too many seats this time around.
Yeah,
it seems to have faded as a priority for many people in the face of a cost of living crisis, obviously a housing crisis.
Yep.
What are the other key issues, and how do you weigh up or balance the ledger? Obviously, the Greens, was founded and still exists primarily as a party for the environment and on climate issues.
Yeah, although it's always for people and planet. So there's the people bit's really important, and I think we've really established ourselves on housing as the only party that's willing to talk up for renters.
Yeah.
So 700,000 West Australians rent, 1/3 of the population.
Yeah.
Do you ever hear government doing anything for those renters? I mean, actually, they did. They passed some new legislation, which still gave us the weakest renting laws in the country. You can now hang up a painting and have a pet, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Still can be evicted for no cause. You can still have your rent go up by extraordinary amounts with no restrictions.
Indeed.
And that's why West Australian rents have gone up higher than anywhere else in the country.
So what does the Greens platform heading to the election look like, and what are the first things you'll do if you've got the balance of power, if you've got a sizable kind of number of upper house seats after the election? So,
I mean, there's a couple. I think on the housing issue, we are really keen to see some big changes in that rental space. It's a couple of things around minimum standards for renters, around people who actually having places that do have insulation, don't have black mould. There should be a responsibility on landlords, so we can reintroduce that act, but with some new amendments that actually strengthen that up. And this is the great thing about having 4 or 5 of us, or maybe even 6 if we're really lucky, is that we can basically only really get an opportunity once or twice a year to introduce legislation.
Yeah.
I can only do one or 2 bits a year, but with all of us, we can do much more of that. Have far more bills.
So will reforms to the Residential Tenancies Act be on the agenda for the Greens after the 25 election?
I would expect so, yep. And so we need to have that conversation around once we all get elected. We don't actually take our seats in the upper house until the 22nd of May. It's kind of a weird lag. But that'll be one of the first things that we work out once we know who we've got and then which are the key bits of legislation that we want to get traction on. And then, of course, we'll need to respond to all the governments as well.
And how do you think the government responds when you come to them and say, hey, you promised climate change bill at the last election, you haven't delivered it? That's one of the first cabs off the rank for us. You say, hey, you passed reforms to renting laws in WA last year, but they're piss weak. They do fuck all. They don't actually help renters in any substantive way at all. We want to have another go at that as well and make some serious digs at it. What sort of response do you expect that gets?
Look, I think it'd be pretty negative, to be honest with you. I mean, this will be a really interesting test, though, because they've been unwilling to even have those conversations in the last parliament because they didn't need to. They said, we don't need to negotiate with you. You don't need your vote. They need our votes now. So, and this will be a really good test for us around how we can, because a lot of this will happen, frankly, behind what's called behind the chair, which actually means outside the parliament. Because what will probably happen in reality is that Labor will say, we agree to that, but we want to introduce it ourselves.
Yeah.
So then we can own it.
Yeah.
So-
And is that a problem? Do you need the Greens badge on it to make it
No,
work?
look, I don't think renters care as long as they get those outcomes. So, look, and I think we will still talk up our role in that, but that will be part of the harsh reality of it, about realising that government would not be keen to give the Greens too many direct wins, and a lot of those will be indirect ones, which Labor will want to brand in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at what's happened federally since the last election, the Greens, who have had, substantial influence, obviously, by upper house seats and some lower house seats, indeed, have driven a pretty hard bargain. I think most people would agree. Some people would call them blockers. The Greens and their supporters would obviously say that they were applying pressure that paid off in the form of, extra social housing investment, in the form of the offshore gas legislation getting parked, all that sort of stuff. Are you going to take the same approach after the election?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to be yourself, and I think ultimately you're right. The federal colleagues have ended up getting some pretty good results as part of those. I mean, I will give being constructive and working with them a really good crack. That's the way I'd like to do it. I mean, I feel like, but ultimately that's going to be up to Labor too. I mean, whilst I'm really happy to sit down and have a rational conversation around what needs to happen, if they're not willing to do that, then ultimately you do have to pay the role of locker, because they're not willing to have the conversation. But and my colleagues and I be really keen to say, look, let's work together on these things. Surely they're just good outcomes.
Yeah.
And again, locking in a renewable energy target. There is an amazing stat. Right now in WA, there is no renewable energy generation under construction on our main grid. None. How is it that we've managed to have because the whole process is stalled because government's so focused on gas that renewable energy, frankly, is just almost not happening. So, there are things that we can do that are a win for the state, but we want to collaborate with Labor on, and I'm happy if they want to, claim some of the credit for that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, negotiation is a negotiation. It'll be interesting to see how collaborative they're willing to be.
All right. You're sounding pretty confident. It sounds like it's all a done deal.
Oh no, there's a long way to go.
Parliament, the balance of power is already in your grasp.
I can see it. But that said, these elections are hard, and I mean it's frustrating. And just I was bemoaning this week around getting traction in the media for us is just painful. Where you have to fight for every little bit.
They don't even seem to want to come after you in an attack dog aggressive way. I'm not even really seeing kind of like hatchet jobs.
No, it's
they're just ignoring you completely.
It's just this kind of so that's kind of frustrating. So then for us, it's around the visibility, and we really need then the direct stuff, the door knocking, the getting out in the community stuff will be really important.
And is that happening? Are you seeing good momentum?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, and lots of good energy and door knock teams out there. It's exciting, actually. But this is a hard state. It's a conservative state, and we've got really disengaged people around politics at the moment. So it's a check. I'm not taking any of this for granted, but I can see an optimistic and extraordinarily different kind of parliament next time if we land this right.
And might that optimistic, extraordinarily different parliament include some independents? We had Kate Hewlett in the chair you're sitting in now last week. In fact, she was actually sitting where I'm sitting. Jared was there. And she's obviously running for the state seat of Fremantle. She's not the only one. There's a couple of other independents taking on Labor seats in Bassendean and Midland. And then in the western suburbs, there's 3 Teal independents kind of taking on what would be traditional heartland Liberal seats in the next election. Firstly, do you mind? Is there room for...
Well, I actually think I don't mind. I think it's actually... they complement each other in many ways. I mean, they're running for lower house seats, ones which we largely don't expect to win. And I actually think they make the races more interesting, especially if there can be some kind of swapping of preferences. All of a sudden, I think it gives both the Greens and the community independents a better chance in those seats. But also, I think anything that starts to break down this major party duopoly, and these guys are so close, there's barely a glimmer of light between them on most issues. The more people we have standing for Parliament that break that apart, the better.
Let 1,000 flowers bloom, you reckon? The more the merrier?
Well, and look, it's certainly, and we're really focused on an upper house campaign where we can, ideally get the balance of power. And look, if we get some Teals and even some Greens in the lower house, that'd be a great bonus, but that would be the bonus.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks, Brad.
Pleasure.
Really appreciate your time.
Good to be with you.
So Brad Pettitt there, the sole Greens representative in the WA Parliament, speaking to you, Jesse, a few moments ago. What do you make of Brad?
Oh, I mean, I've known Brad for years. I love Brad. Brad's great value, good fun, real nice guy. Have to say, probably about the best performance I've seen from Brad with the cameras rolling. I reckon that was a really, really enjoyable conversation.
Something about Last Place HQ that maybe makes him feel at home.
Or maybe it's just the idea of new media in general. Maybe Brad's a streamer and a podcaster at heart.
Yeah.
A TikTok star
could be
in
next.
the offing potentially if the Greens can get their act together and reactivate the page. If there's time before the TikTok ban comes into effect, is it coming?
That's right. Well, that's the big question. I did write a piece about this, which is up on the Last Place on Earth website. I mean, obviously TikTok's still going to be accessible in Australia, whether or not it's banned in the US. How kind of potent and engaging it
what
is
would be the impact,
question.
do you think? I mean, what percentage do you think of the content itself and then of the kind of the source material does the US generate on TikTok these days?
Well, I did a very unscientific scroll through 40 videos on my feed earlier, and I think 17 or 18 of them were from the US.
Right, okay.
But even then, the ones that aren't from the US, the US cultural imperialism is still a powerful thing.
Is the For You page downstream of, American TikTok?
Mine is, at least. I mean, I think that's the nature of the For You page. It's different for everyone. But I mean, having said that, I was kind of surprised by how much Australian stuff I was getting served.
I'm just getting European cricket.
Right, I get none of that.
There's this European Cricket League where they all look like they're batting with the wrong hand and racking up scores of like 403 off 10 overs or whatever. Right. I just get video after video after video of hilarious drop catches, of people stumbling over the ropes, of batters colliding into each other. So for me...
That sounds pretty good.
It's really good. For me, Central Europe is the engine room and the locus of most of the content I'm getting pushed.
I mean, that's the nature of TikTok, is that you truly choose your own adventure, or it chooses it for you, but that's always kind of been a blurry line.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I would be very, very surprised if the TikTok ban happens, and I'd be even more surprised if it happens and then it remains in place. I just can't see a world in which Donald Trump isn't going to make sure that he saves TikTok. And I think that, I mean, as I said in the piece that I wrote, if he can apparently kind of just through force of will and persuasion convince Israel to agree to a ceasefire, surely he can create the circumstances where TikTok is allowed in the App Store. But we'll see.
God willing, inshallah.
TikTok being banned is such a TikTok-worthy event. Like, I feel like TikTok is so good at responding to kind of like chaotic and kind of dystopian moments, like just people kind of shitposting through. And so the content that has come out of this has been fantastic. It's been really quite engaging. So
I've missed most of it, to be honest. As I say, my page is probably somewhat limited by the interests that I've fed into it over the past couple of weeks since I've got back on. What sort of stuff are we talking about?
I mean, there was one TikTok I saw earlier which kind of tickled me, which was a young girl saying, "Oh, who's going to tell my new boss that the platform he just hired me to make videos for is banned in like 2 days," which I thought was pretty funny.
That's pretty cute.
Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of stuff.
I like the idea of saying goodbye to your personal Chinese spy, all that kind of thing. And I also, one thing I have locked onto, I do love all these newly bilingual US teens talking fluent Mandarin and extolling the virtues of the Chinese alternatives.
Duolingo posted a graph of the Mandarin uptake, and it's like it's parabolic.
Soft diplomacy. Another win for President Trump. He's done it again.
Yeah. So I mean, look, in some ways, I'd love it if TikTok was something that I never had to look at again. We've been talking a little bit lately just about how it seems to be kind of like just utterly banal, kind of like spiritually bankrupt, I think.
If not actively pernicious. Like there is some sort of dark heart.
Dark energy emanating from that app. Yeah. And I guess, this is the kind of like a question that I've been playing with a lot lately is, what should my relationship be to these things? Because I think, they are all made by these big companies who are trying to make money, who are creating products that are just getting like increasingly worse, that are, creating a massive drain on the climate just through the use of AI and data centers and all of these things. And it's like, can I use these things to wage this kind of weird political warfare, or am I better to just kind of fucking put it down? But
got to be in the game to play the game, right?
You've got to be in the game to play the game. I mean, I guess that's the thing, is that you kind of can create the terrain or the board on which you play the game sometimes, but you need your opponents to have some kind of opposition in the games they're playing as well. So
time to unveil the new streaming app we've been developing here at Last Place HQ sometime next week, perhaps after the inauguration.
Yeah, exactly. And if you are on social media, have a look at the Last Place on Earth channels.
Yeah, our content's completely different. Ours is elevating.
Well, we try and be
enriching,
somewhat highbrow. Yeah, we try and be somewhat
Yeah.
highbrow, more so than the Minerals Council and their recent foray into.
We're basically the digital equivalent of the New Yorker. It's how you ought to consider.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, we're richer than a lot of what's out there. So we're on TikTok, we're on Instagram. Have a look there.
Check us out.
Yep.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Jesse. Cheers.
Good on you. Cheers. See ya.
Bye.